winter of 1957, the leadership of the People's Republic of China looked out at the world with a sense of immense optimism and urgent ambition. The country had unified after decades of fragmentation and civil war, and the initial years of governance had yielded economic stability. However, for Chairman Mao Zedong, stability was not enough. He looked toward the industrial giants of the West, specifically Great Britain and the United States, and set a target that seemed impossible to outside observers. China aimed to surpass the industrial output of Great Britain within 15 years. This objective marked the beginning of the Great Leap Forward. It was a campaign designed to bypass the traditional, slow stages of economic development. Instead of waiting for capital investment and technological accumulation, the Chinese state planned to leverage its greatest resource, which was the sheer manpower of its vast population. The central idea was that human willpower and mass mobilization could overcome physical and economic constraints. What followed between 1958 and 1962 was a tragedy of unprecedented scale. Rather than an industrial utopia, the campaign precipitated a famine that claimed the lives of tens of millions of people. Demographic historians and researchers have spent decades analyzing the census data from this period. While estimates vary, detailed studies place the number of premature deaths between 30 million and 45 million. This stands as the largest recorded famine in human history. In this episode, we will trace the origins and execution of this campaign and how the logical structures of the state were dismantled in favor of ideological purity. Part 1. The Road to the People's Republic. Following the end of the Second World War in 1945, the landscape of China was defined by a power vacuum left by the retreating Japanese forces. The conflict had devastated the country, but peace did not follow the Japanese surrender. Instead, the uneasy alliance between the ruling Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, dissolved almost immediately. The two factions had paused their hostilities to fight the common external enemy, but with the foreign occupier gone, the Chinese Civil War resumed with intense ferocity. The United States supported the nationalists, recognizing them as the legitimate government and the bulwark against communist expansion in Asia. The nationalist forces held the major cities and possessed superior military equipment. However, the Communist Party had spent the war years embedding itself in the rural countryside, building a base of support among the peasantry who made up the vast majority of the population. Mao Zedong utilized a strategy of mobilizing these rural masses to surround and isolate the nationalist-controlled cities. By 1948, the momentum had shifted decisively. The nationalist government was plagued by hyperinflation and corruption, eroding its support among the urban middle class, while the Communist People's Liberation Army secured key victories in the north. In 1949, the nationalist government retreated to the island of Taiwan. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The new government faced the immediate task of rebuilding a nation shattered by decades of conflict. The initial priority was the consolidation of control and the restructuring of society to align with Marxist-Leninist ideology. A central pillar of this restructuring was land reform. For centuries, the Chinese countryside had been dominated by a system of landlords and tenant farmers. The Communist Party had promised to dismantle this hierarchy, and they moved quickly to fulfill that pledge. Work teams from the party were sent into villages across the country to classify the population. Residents were labeled based on their economic status, designated as landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, or poor peasants. The party organized Speak Bitterness sessions where poor peasants were encouraged to confront landlords and accuse them of past abuses. These sessions frequently turned violent. The land reform campaign resulted in the redistribution of approximately 43% of China's cultivated land to 60% of the rural population. It destroyed the landlord class as a social and economic force. Estimates suggest that between 1 million and 2 million landlords were killed during this period. For the peasantry, this cemented their loyalty to the new regime. They had been given land, but they were also now complicit in the violence of the revolution, binding their fate to the survival of the party itself. With political control established, the leadership turned its attention to the economy. In the early 1950s, China looked to the Soviet Union as its model. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had transformed from an agrarian society into an industrial superpower, and the Chinese leadership sought to replicate this success. Thousands of Soviet advisors arrived in Beijing to assist in the drafting of the first five-year plan, which ran from 1953 to 1957. The first five-year plan focused heavily on the development of heavy industry, such as steel, coal, and machinery. The state nationalized private industries in the cities. In the countryside, the party began to encourage peasants to pool their resources. The land that had just been given to individual households was slowly aggregated back into mutual aid teams and then into agricultural producers' cooperatives. The rationale was that larger plots of land could be farmed more efficiently and would allow for mechanization. The economic results of this period were positive. Industrial output grew significantly and agricultural production remained stable. Bridges were built over the Yangtze River and new factories churned out trucks and aircraft. This success instilled a deep sense of confidence in the party leadership. They believed they had found the correct formula for rapid development. However, the political atmosphere shifted dramatically in 1956. In the Soviet Union, the new leader Nikita Khrushchev delivered a secret speech denouncing the crimes of Stalin. This de-Stalinization campaign sent shockwaves through the communist world. In China, Mao Zedong sought to prevent a similar loss of authority while also addressing tensions that had arisen within the party and the bureaucracy. He believed that the party had become too bureaucratic and detached from the people. To address this, Mao launched the 100 Flowers campaign in 1956. The name was derived from a classical poem with the slogan, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." The campaign invited intellectuals, artists, and ordinary citizens to offer criticism of the party and its policies. Mao anticipated that the criticism would be mild and constructive, directed mostly at low-level corruption or inefficiency, and that it would ultimately validate his leadership. Initially, the response was hesitant. Intellectuals were wary of a trap. In February 1957, Mao gave a speech titled "On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People," explicitly encouraging open expression. Following this reassurance, the floodgates opened. During the spring of 1957, millions of letters and posters appeared. The criticism was far more severe than the leadership had anticipated. As well as complaining about minor bureaucratic issues, the people questioned the monopoly on power held by the Communist Party. They criticized the lack of human rights, the privileged lifestyle of party cadres, and the interference of political commissars in scientific and artistic fields. University students put up democracy walls, covered in posters demanding political freedom. The party leadership was alarmed. They viewed this outpouring as a counter-revolutionary threat that challenged the legitimacy of the regime. The window of openness was abruptly slammed shut in the summer of 1957. Mao Zedong replaced the 100 Flowers campaign with the anti-rightist campaign. The objective was to identify and purge the critics who had revealed themselves. The criteria for being labeled a rightist were vague and broad, allowing local officials to target anyone who had shown insufficient enthusiasm for party policies or who had past associations with the nationalist government or Western institutions. Deng Xiaoping, who was then the Secretary-General of the Secretariat, played a key role in orchestrating the crackdown. A quota system was often implemented, where units were required to identify 5% of their staff as rightists. This forced officials to find victims even when none existed, leading to false accusations against colleagues and subordinates to meet the target. Over 500,000 people were labeled as rightists. These included many of the country's most educated citizens, engineers, scientists, writers, and teachers. The punishments ranged from public humiliation and the loss of their jobs to imprisonment and forced labor in the vast network of prison camps known as the Laogai. Many were sent to remote border regions to be re-educated through labor, where they faced harsh conditions and high mortality rates. The impact of the anti-rightist campaign extended far beyond the individuals who were purged. It fundamentally altered the political culture of the People's Republic. The campaign sent a clear and terrifying message to every official and citizen in China: Criticism of the leadership results in ruin. Intellectual honesty was equated with political treachery. This silencing of dissent created an echo chamber around the central leadership. Lower-level officials learned that the only way to survive and advance was to enthusiastically agree with whatever directives came from Beijing. If the central government asked for increased production, the local officials would promise to double it. If the center suggested a new policy, the provinces would rush to implement it more radically than their neighbors to prove their loyalty. By the end of 1957, the checks and balances of internal debate had been dismantled. The experts who might have warned against economic recklessness were either in labor camps or too terrified to speak. The statistical bureaus that tracked the reality of the economy had been politicized. The stage was set for a new, radical initiative. Mao Zedong, emboldened by the silencing of his critics and eager to break away from the Soviet model of slow development, was ready to push the country into a rapid acceleration. The caution of the first five-year plan was discarded. The road to the Great Leap Forward was now open. Part 2. The Communes and the Canteens. In the spring of 1958, the political silence achieved by the anti-rightist campaign created the conditions for a radical shift in policy. With critical voices silenced, the central leadership felt emboldened to abandon the gradual Soviet-style economic planning that had characterized the early 1950s. Mao Zedong viewed the Soviet model as sluggish and overly bureaucratic. He believed it relied too heavily on a class of technical experts and ignored the revolutionary potential of the Chinese peasantry. In May 1958, at the second session of the Eighth Party Congress, the party formally adopted the General Line for Socialist Construction. The slogan that defined this new era was simple and aggressive: go all out, aim high, and achieve greater, faster, better, and more economical results. This was the official launch of the Great Leap Forward. The mechanism chosen to achieve this acceleration was the People's Commune. Prior to 1958, rural China had already been organized into agricultural cooperatives, where farmers pooled their land and tools, but still retained some degree of individual ownership and autonomy. The commune was designed to be something entirely different. It was a massive amalgamation of these smaller cooperatives, merging thousands of households into a single social, economic, and administrative unit. The first prototype for this new organization appeared in Henan province in April 1958. It was named the Sputnik Commune, referencing the Soviet satellite that had been launched the previous year. The name symbolized speed, technology, and the ascent of the socialist world. The Sputnik Commune merged 27 smaller agricultural cooperatives, encompassing over 9,000 households and 43,000 people. The success of Sputnik was praised by Mao Zedong in August 1958. His endorsement acted as a signal to the rest of the country. Provincial officials, eager to prove their loyalty and revolutionary zeal, raced to merge their own cooperatives into communes. The speed of this transformation was staggering. In August, roughly 30% of rural households were in communes. By the end of October, that figure had risen to more than 99%. In the span of just a few months, the social structure of rural China, which had evolved over millennia, was completely erased and rewritten. The People's Commune was a totalizing institution. It abolished the distinction between government administration and economic production. The commune leaders were also the local government officials. They controlled every aspect of life, from the allocation of labor to the distribution of food, and even the approval of marriages. The most significant change for the individual peasant was the abolition of private property. In the earlier cooperatives, peasants had still owned their small plots of land, their homes, and their domestic animals. Under the commune system, everything was transferred to the collective. Land deeds were burned or handed over to the state. Livestock, including pigs and chickens, became the property of the commune. Farm tools were collected. This confiscation extended into the domestic sphere. The planners of the Great Leap Forward believed that the traditional household was an obstacle to industrialization. They argued that domestic chores such as cooking, cleaning, and child rearing were inefficient uses of labor. If these tasks could be collectivized, it would free up millions of women to work in the fields and factories. To achieve this, the privacy of the home was systematically dismantled. In many regions, officials went house to house, confiscating cooking stoves, woks, tables, and chairs. This served a dual purpose. First, it physically prevented peasants from cooking their own meals, forcing them to rely on the commune. Second, the metal from the stoves and woks was often scrapped to meet the insatiable demand for iron and steel. The replacement for the home kitchen was the communal canteen. This was the centerpiece of the new collective life. The party propaganda painted the canteens as the realization of the communist utopia. The slogan, "Eating for free," spread across the countryside. For a peasantry that had lived on the edge of subsistence for generations, the promise that the state would provide unlimited food was intoxicating. When the canteens first opened in the autumn of 1958, the mood was euphoric. The harvest of 1958 had been strong, and the granaries were full. The commune leaders, believing the rhetoric that agricultural yields were about to skyrocket, instructed the canteens to implement an open-stomach policy. Food was supplied on demand. Eyewitness accounts from this period describe scenes of gluttony that were previously unimaginable in rural China. Peasants who were accustomed to a diet of grain porridge and vegetables were suddenly presented with white rice, steamed buns, and pork. People competed to see who could eat the most. There was a sense that the days of scarcity were gone forever. The iron rice bowl, the guarantee of job security and food provided by the state, seemed to have arrived. However, this system bred immense waste. Because the food was free and communal, there was no incentive to conserve it. People would take more than they could eat and discard the rest. The canteens operated without budgets, drawing down on the grain reserves that were meant to sustain the village through the winter and into the next spring. In some areas, the consumption rate was 3 to 4 times the normal level. The leadership in Beijing encouraged this, with Mao remarking that if there was too much grain, the people should just eat 5 meals a day. While the canteens took over the biological function of the family, other institutions took over the social functions. The Great Leap Forward mandated the creation of communal nurseries and boarding schools for children and happiness homes for the elderly. The intention was to relieve working-age adults of all caretaking responsibilities so they could be deployed like an army of laborers. Mothers were encouraged, and often forced, to drop their infants off at these nurseries in the morning before marching out to the fields. The rhetoric framed this as the liberation of women. By removing the burden of domestic work, the party argued women were finally equal to men in their ability to contribute to the socialist state. The reality of these institutions was often far from the propaganda. The nurseries were frequently staffed by older women or teenagers who were too weak for field work, but had no training in childcare. In many places, the facilities were unsanitary and overcrowded. Illnesses spread rapidly among the children. Similarly, the happiness homes for the elderly were often neglected. Once the family unit was broken, the traditional Confucian obligation of children to care for their aging parents was severed. The elderly, who could not contribute to the intense physical labor required by the commune, were often seen as a burden on the collective resources. Life in the commune became highly militarized. The peasants were organized into brigades and production teams. They marched to the fields in formation, often to the sound of bugles or drums. Flags flew over the worksites. The language used to describe farming became martial, fields were battlegrounds, and harvests were victories. This regimentation extended to the hours of work. The promise of the Great Leap was that hard work for a few years would lead to 1,000 years of happiness. To achieve this, the peasants were pushed to their physical limits. The workday was extended into the night. It was not uncommon for production teams to work under the light of lanterns and torches, striving to meet the ambitious targets set by the local cadres. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. The connection between effort and reward was broken. In the past, a farmer worked hard because the harvest belonged to his family. If he worked well, his family ate well. In the commune system, the output belonged to the state, and the food in the canteen was available regardless of how hard one worked. This naturally led to a decline in motivation known as the free rider problem. To counter this, the cadres relied on coercion and political pressure. Those who complained about the long hours, the quality of the food in the canteens, or the separation from their children were often accused of rightist thinking. Given the recent memory of the anti-rightist purges, few dared to speak up. The cadres, under immense pressure from their superiors to show results, began to exercise total control over the lives of the commune members. Since the commune controlled the food supply, the ultimate punishment for disobedience was the withholding of rations. The canteen, intended to be a source of abundance, became a tool of control. By the winter of 1958, the initial euphoria of the free food began to fade. The open stomach policy had drained the reserves at an alarming rate. The wastefulness of the early months meant that stocks were running low just as the winter set in. The quality of the food in the canteens began to deteriorate. The thick stews and meat dishes were replaced by watery gruel. Furthermore, the destruction of the private home had unintended consequences. Without their own stoves, peasants could not boil water or cook supplementary food to aid the sick or the elderly. They were entirely dependent on the collective schedule. If the canteen closed, there was nothing to eat. If the canteen ran out of fuel, there was no warm food. The restructuring of rural China in 1958 was total. It stripped the peasantry of their assets, their autonomy, and their family structure. It placed their survival entirely in the hands of a state apparatus that was operating on inflated optimism and political dogma. The commune system had successfully mobilized the population, gathering millions of people to work on the state's projects. But in doing so, it had removed the safety mechanisms that had allowed rural communities to survive for centuries. The granaries were emptying, the workforce was exhausted, and the system was rigid. As the country moved into 1959, the vulnerability of this new social structure would be tested by the demands of the steel campaign and the fantastical agricultural theories that were about to be implemented. Part 3. Steel, Sparrows, and Pseudoscience. The ambition of the Great Leap Forward extended to the physical transformation of the material world. The central leadership in Beijing believed that the laws of economics and the laws of nature were flexible, bending to the will of a mobilized revolutionary force. This belief manifested most clearly in the three major campaigns of 1958. The drive for steel production, the war against pests, and the adoption of radical new agricultural sciences. The first of these campaigns was born from the obsession with heavy industry. In the mid-20th century, steel was the universal metric of national power. It was a material of tanks, ships, bridges, and factories. For Mao Zedong, surpassing the industrial output of Great Britain was the primary objective. In 1957, the annual steel production of China stood at 5.35 million tons. In February 1958, the target for the year was set at 6.2 million tons. By May, the target was raised to 8 million. By August, the leadership demanded 10.7 million tons. This target was physically impossible using the existing industrial infrastructure. Building modern blast furnaces required capital, time, and technical expertise, all of which were in short supply. However, the logic of the Great Leap Forward dictated that where capital was lacking, labor could be substituted. The solution proposed was the backyard furnace. The government directed the population to build small, primitive clay furnaces in every available space. They appeared in the courtyards of government offices, in the playgrounds of schools, in the middle of communal fields, and in the backyards of peasant homes. The entire country was mobilized to tend to these fires. Doctors, teachers, and farmers were pulled away from their primary duties to act as amateur metallurgists. The demand for fuel to feed these millions of furnaces was insatiable. China's coal reserves were difficult to transport to the rural areas where the furnaces were located. To solve this, the collectives turned to the nearest available source of fuel, the forests. Vast tracts of woodland were clear-cut. When the wood ran out, the mobilization turned inward. Peasants were ordered to dismantle their own houses. Wooden doors, window frames, and furniture were fed into the fires. The scarcity of fuel was matched by a scarcity of iron ore. The remote villages often had no access to mining sites. To meet the quotas handed down by the provincial officials, the local cadres ordered the population to scavenge for scrap metal. This quickly escalated into the destruction of essential tools. Peasants were forced to melt down their cooking woks, which were no longer needed due to the communal canteens. They melted down farming implements, door handles, bicycles, and even the iron nails holding their homes together. The result of this frantic activity was a disaster. The backyard furnaces were not hot enough to produce steel. Instead, they produced pig iron, a brittle, high-carbon material that was prone to cracking and useless for industrial construction. By the autumn of 1958, the landscape was dotted with millions of blowing furnaces, producing smoke that blotted out the sun by day and lit up the horizon by night. When the leadership finally inspected the output, the reality became undeniable. The metal was useless. However, the political climate made it dangerous to admit failure. The pig iron was collected and buried, or stacked in useless piles near rail lines, while the state media continued to trumpet the success of the campaign. The cost of this exercise was astronomical. It had stripped the countryside of its trees, causing soil erosion. It had destroyed the very tools necessary for agriculture. And critically, it had diverted millions of able-bodied laborers away from the fields during the crucial harvest season. While the population was battling to produce steel, they were simultaneously enlisted in a war against nature itself. This was the Four Pests campaign. The government identified 4 biological enemies that were hindering progress: flies, mosquitoes, rats, and sparrows. While the first 3 were targeted for hygiene reasons, the Eurasian tree sparrow was targeted for economic reasons. The central planners calculated that a single sparrow consumed approximately 4.5 kilograms of grain per year. They extrapolated that for every 1 million sparrows killed, food for 60,000 people could be saved. The sparrow was labeled a thief of the people's labor. The campaign against the sparrow was total. It was more than a hunting expedition. It was designed to exhaust the birds. On designated days, the entire population of a city or village would take to the streets and rooftops. People banged pots and pans, beat drums, crashed cymbals, and shouted. The goal was to create a wall of noise that prevented the birds from landing. Terrified by the din, the sparrows would fly in circles until they died of exhaustion and fell from the sky. In Beijing, the campaign reached a fever pitch. Students, civil servants, and factory workers were issued rifles, slingshots, and long poles to knock nests out of trees. A specific incident involving the Polish embassy in Beijing illustrates the intensity of the fervor. The embassy grounds, being diplomatic territory, were off-limits to the Chinese crowds. Sparrows, seeking refuge from the noise, flocked to the embassy's trees. The crowds outside, unable to enter, surrounded the compound and maintained a deafening barrage of drum beats and shouting for 2 consecutive days. The Polish diplomats, initially refusing to cooperate, were eventually forced to use shovels to clear the piles of dead birds that had fallen into their courtyard. The campaign was statistically successful. Estimates suggest that hundreds of millions of sparrows were killed. The near extinction of the bird in China was celebrated as a victory for human willpower. However, the ecological consequences were ignored. The sparrow is a natural predator of insects, particularly locusts. With the predator removed, the insect population exploded. The following year, swarms of locusts would descend on the crops, free to devour the harvest without natural opposition. The third pillar of the 1958 campaigns was the revolution in agricultural science. Just as the party rejected Western economic models, it also rejected Western biology. The scientific consensus on genetics and agriculture was dismissed as bourgeois. In its place, China adopted the theories of the Soviet agronomist Trofim Lysenko. Lysenkoism was a pseudo-science that rejected the existence of genes. Lysenko argued that the environment alone determined the traits of a plant and that these acquired traits could be inherited. This fit perfectly with the Marxist dialectic. If human nature could be molded by the social environment, then plant nature could be molded by the physical environment. Mao Zedong codified these theories into the 8-point Charter for Agriculture. 2 of the most destructive tenets of this charter were close planting and deep ploughing. Traditional farming wisdom dictated that seeds must be spaced out to allow each plant enough light, nutrients, and root space. Lysenko's theory, however, applied a political logic to botany. It argued that plants of the same class would not compete with each other. Instead, they would show class solidarity and grow together in harmony. Based on this, local officials ordered peasants to sow seeds at densities 5 to 10 times higher than the traditional limit. In some extreme cases, the density was increased by a factor of 100. The reality of biology, however, did not conform to political theory. The densely packed seedlings competed fiercely for the limited nutrients in the soil. Deprived of sunlight and air circulation, the crops grew weak and spindly, or simply rotted in the ground. To support this density, the charter mandated deep ploughing. The theory was that the soil deep underground was more fertile than the topsoil, and that roots could be encouraged to grow indefinitely downward. Peasants were ordered to plough the earth to depths of 1 to 2 meters. In doing so, they brought up rocks, clay, and sterile subsoil, burying the fertile topsoil that had been cultivated for centuries. This destroyed the soil structure and further reduced yields. The application of fertilizer also became a manic performance. The demand for manure and compost led to the destruction of more property. Mud houses, particularly those made of adobe, were pulled down so the earth, which was believed to be rich in nutrients from years of cooking smoke, could be spread on the fields. As with the steel campaign, the failure of these agricultural methods was concealed by a massive deception. When high-ranking officials toured the countryside, local cadres created Sputnik fields. These were small plots of land where crops from other fields had been transplanted overnight to create the illusion of incredible density. One famous photograph from this era shows children standing on top of a field of wheat, ostensibly proving that the crop was so thick it could support a human's weight. In reality, the wheat had been packed so tightly for the photo op that it was dying, and benches were often hidden beneath the stalks to support the children. The cumulative effect of these three campaigns was a catastrophic degradation of China's capacity to feed itself. The backyard furnaces diverted labor away from the harvest. The sparrow campaign removed the natural check on pests. The new agricultural techniques destroyed the soil and killed the crops. Yet, throughout 1958, the official reports sent to Beijing told a different story. The provinces competed to report the most astronomical figures. If one region reported a harvest of 500 kilograms, the neighboring region would report 1,000, and the next would report 5,000. These inflated figures, known as launching satellites, became the basis for state policy. The central government, believing the reports that China had produced a historic surplus of grain, began to make decisions based on a fantasy. They increased grain exports to the Soviet Union to pay for heavy machinery. They offered food aid to other developing nations to buy political influence. Domestically, they reduced the land area dedicated to grain production, believing the problem was now an oversupply of food. By the winter of 1958, the gap between the paper reality and the physical reality was widening into a chasm. The peasants in the communes had exhausted their reserves. The fields had been mismanaged, the tools had been melted down, and the weather, which had been favorable in 1958, was about to turn. The stage was set for the collapse. The leadership, however, remained insulated from the truth, surrounded by a wall of fabricated statistics and terrified subordinates. It would take a brave act of defiance to try and break this silence, and that confrontation would take place at a mountain resort in the summer of 1959. Part 4. The Turning Point. The Lushan Conference. By the summer of 1959, the disparity between the official statistics and the reality on the ground had become difficult to ignore, even for the central leadership in Beijing. The initial euphoria of the Great Leap Forward was fading. Reports were filtering up through the bureaucracy of food shortages, exhausted laborers, and the poor quality of the goods being produced. In July 1959, the top echelon of the Communist Party gathered for an expanded Politburo meeting. The location was Lushan, a scenic mountain resort in Jiangxi province that had formerly been a retreat for European missionaries and wealthy officials. The cool mountain air provided a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of the plains below, where the harvest was beginning to fail. The original purpose of the Lushan Conference was to moderate the pace of the Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong himself had admitted that there were some issues with leftist errors, meaning that local officials had perhaps been too zealous in their implementation of the policies. The goal was to correct these excesses, consolidate the gains, and move forward more cautiously. However, the trajectory of the conference and the fate of the Chinese nation was altered by the actions of one man, Marshal Peng Dehuai. Peng Dehuai was the Minister of Defense and one of the most senior figures in the People's Republic. He was a war hero, having commanded the Chinese forces during the Korean War. He was known within the party for his bluntness, his simple lifestyle, and his genuine concern for the peasantry. Unlike many of the urban intellectuals in the party, Peng came from a poor peasant background and maintained close ties to his home village. Prior to the conference, Peng had undertaken a tour of his home province of Hunan. What he saw there shocked him. He did not see the utopian abundance described in the official reports. Instead, he saw fields that had been abandoned because the men were manning the backyard furnaces. He saw women and children struggling to harvest crops that were rotting in the ground. He saw the communal canteens running out of grain and the pots and pans of the villagers melted down into useless lumps of metal. During his visit, a veteran of the Red Army had handed him a piece of paper with a poem written on it. The poem described the suffering of the people, stating that the grain was scattered on the ground, the potato leaves were withered, and the young and strong had gone to make steel, while the children and old women were left to starve. This encounter deeply affected Peng. He realized that the wind of exaggeration, the inflation of production figures by local officials, was hiding a catastrophe. When Peng arrived at Lushan, he found that many other leaders privately shared his concerns. However, the atmosphere was tentative. Mao Zedong was the architect of the leap, and criticizing the policy was dangerously close to criticizing the chairman himself. On July 14, 1959, Peng Dehuai decided to speak up. He did not make a public speech denouncing Mao. Instead, he wrote a private letter to the chairman. The tone of the letter was respectful and measured. Peng affirmed the general correctness of the Great Leap Forward and praised the achievements of 1958. He did not call for the cancellation of the Communes. However, the core of the letter addressed the problems he had witnessed. He criticized the petty bourgeois fanaticism that had gripped the party. He pointed out that the habit of exaggerating statistics had severed the party's connection to reality. He argued that the backyard steel furnaces were a waste of resources and that the economic laws of exchange had been violated. He wrote that the party had become dizzy with success and had forgotten the tradition of seeking truth from facts. Peng believed he was offering constructive criticism to an old comrade. He expected Mao to accept the feedback and use it to steer the conference toward a pragmatic solution. This was a fatal miscalculation. Mao Zedong received the letter and remained silent for 3 days. He did not reply to Peng. Instead, on July 17th, he ordered the letter to be printed and distributed to every delegate at the conference. He gave it a title, Comrade Peng Dehuai's Statement of Opinions. By distributing it without comment, Mao invited the other delegates to judge it. As the conference continued, Mao launched a counterattack. On July the 23rd, he convened a general meeting. He spoke for hours in a rambling, emotional address. He interpreted Peng's letter as a personal attack on his leadership and a challenge to the legitimacy of the revolution. Mao used extreme rhetoric. He threatened that if the party abandoned the Great Leap Forward, he would go to the countryside to lead the peasants to overthrow the government. He accused Peng of conspiring with foreign powers, specifically the Soviet Union. Relations between China and the Soviet Union had been deteriorating, and Nikita Khrushchev had recently criticized the commune system. Mao, in a fit of paranoia, believed that Peng, who had recently visited Moscow, was acting as an agent of Soviet influence. The political dynamic at Lushan shifted instantly. The other senior leaders, including Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai, saw that Mao was willing to destroy the party unity to protect his policy. Faced with the choice of supporting Peng and risking their own careers, or supporting Mao and surviving, they chose the latter. Peng Dehuai was isolated. He was stripped of his position as Minister of Defense. He was forced to undergo humiliating struggle sessions where he had to confess to his crimes against the party. The conference passed a resolution labeling him the leader of an anti-party clique. The consequences of the Lushan conference were immediate and devastating. The initial plan to moderate the Great Leap Forward was abandoned. Because Peng Dehuai had criticized the radical policies, any criticism of the policies was now equated with treason. To prove their loyalty to Mao and to distance themselves from Peng, officials across the country swung hard to the left. They launched a new, anti-rightist campaign within the party. Local cadres who had previously hesitated to report fake statistics now felt they had no choice. If they reported a food shortage, they would be accused of rightist opportunism and purged just like Peng Dehuai. The wind of exaggeration that Peng had warned about turned into a gale. Provinces began to report even more ludicrous harvest figures to show their defiance of the rightists. In response, the central government increased its procurement quotas. They took more grain from the villages based on these fantasy numbers, leaving the peasants with absolutely nothing. The Lushan Conference was the point of no return. In the summer of 1959, the famine was a manageable crisis. The harvest had been poor, but with rational distribution and a halt to the radical policies, millions of lives could have been saved. By the time the conference ended in August, the crisis had been turned into a political imperative. The machinery of the state was now locked on a course that guaranteed mass starvation. The silence that fell over Lushan in August 1959 sealed the fate of the Chinese peasantry for the next 2 years. Part 5. The Great Famine. Following the Lushan Conference in the summer of 1959, the political machinery of the People's Republic of China locked onto a collision course with reality. The purging of Marshal Peng Dehuai sent a shockwave through the provincial administration. The message was unambiguous. Reporting agricultural failure was tantamount to treason. To protect themselves, officials at every level of the hierarchy began to engage in a competitive escalation of falsehoods. This phenomenon was known as the wind of exaggeration. In the autumn of 1959, as the harvest was being brought in, local cadres reported figures that were entirely divorced from the physical yield of the land. In many provinces, the reported harvest was double or even triple the actual amount of grain collected. These fabricated numbers were the data points upon which the central government calculated its tax and procurement quotas. The state operated on a system of centralized procurement. The government took a calculated percentage of the harvest to feed the cities, to supply the military, and to export abroad for foreign currency. Because the central planners believed the inflated production figures, they set the procurement quotas astronomically high. When the collection teams arrived in the villages, they demanded the state's share based on the fantasy numbers. In many cases, the state procurement quota exceeded the entire actual harvest. To meet the demands of Beijing, local officials were forced to confiscate everything. They emptied the communal granaries. They swept the private homes for seed grain reserved for the next year's planting. They took the feed grain meant for livestock. When this was still not enough to meet the quota, the political logic of the time dictated that the peasants must be hiding food. The anti-hiding grain campaigns began in the winter of 1959. These were violent inquisitions led by local militias. Party cadres, under immense pressure to fulfill their targets, turned on the population they were supposed to lead. Peasants were accused of hoarding grain and were subjected to brutal interrogations. Beating and torture became commonplace as officials tried to extract food that did not exist. Houses were raided, floors were dug up, and walls were smashed in the search for concealed caches. With the grain removed to the cities or locked away in state warehouses, the communal canteens in the countryside collapsed. The iron rice bowl was empty. The famine that descended on rural China between 1959 and 1961 was uneven. Its severity depended on the zeal of the local provincial leaders. It was most intense in the regions where officials were most eager to prove their loyalty to the radical leftist ideology. The epicenter of this disaster was the Xinjiang prefecture in Hainan province. The events that unfolded there, known as the Xinjiang incident, serve as a grim case study for the broader catastrophe. The leader of Hainan province was Wu Shipu, a hardline supporter of the Great Leap Forward who had promised to transform Hainan into a model of communist abundance. In 1959, the harvest in Xinjiang failed due to a combination of drought and the mismanagement of the agricultural techniques discussed earlier. Despite this, the local officials reported a record-breaking yield. The state procurement teams stripped the region bare. By the winter, over 10 million people in the prefecture were without food. As starvation set in, The population attempted to flee. In previous famines in Chinese history, the natural response of the peasantry was to migrate, becoming refugees who would travel to cities or other provinces to beg for food. In 1959, this survival mechanism was blocked by the state. The household registration system, or hukou, already restricted residents, but now physical barriers were erected. The local militia in Xinjiang set up roadblocks on all major routes leaving the prefecture. The train stations were guarded. Peasants found wandering on the roads were arrested, beaten, and sent back to their communes. The post offices were ordered to intercept letters addressed to Beijing or the provincial capital. The region was effectively sealed off. The starving population was trapped inside what became a vast prison. Inside the villages of Xinjiang, the social order disintegrated. The communal kitchens, which had confiscated all cooking utensils the previous year, now served nothing but hot water. Because the peasants had been stripped of their woks and stoves, they could not even boil wild vegetation in their own homes. Lighting a fire in a private home was a criminal offense, viewed as a signal that the occupant was cooking stolen grain. The smoke from a chimney would attract the militia, leading to confiscation and beatings. By the spring of 1960, the death toll in Xinjiang had reached terrifying proportions. Entire families died in their homes. In some villages, there was no one left with the strength to bury the dead. Corpses were left in the fields or by the roadside. The official investigation conducted years later admitted that over 1 million people died in the Xinjiang prefecture alone during this period. Across China, the story of Xinjiang was repeated to varying degrees. As the grain supplies vanished, the population turned to desperate measures to survive. The diet of the Chinese peasantry devolved in a tragic, predictable sequence. First, they consumed the feed meant for animals. When that was gone, they turned to the natural world. People scoured the hillsides for wild herbs and grasses. When the greenery was exhausted, they began to eat the trees. The bark of elm and pine trees was stripped away. It was ground into a fine powder and mixed with water to form a paste. This paste was difficult to digest and offered little nutritional value, but it filled the stomach. As the famine deepened, the search for food became even more surreal. People began to eat leather. Belts, shoes, and saddles were boiled for hours until they softened enough to be chewed. In many regions, the peasants turned to the earth itself. There is a type of white clay known as kaolin or guangxi earth, which is rich in aluminium and normally used in the production of porcelain. In their desperation, people began to eat this clay. The clay had a sweet, earthy taste and, most importantly, it suppressed the pangs of hunger. However, the human digestive system cannot process kaolin. The clay would solidify in the intestines, creating a cement-like block that caused excruciating pain. Many who ate the clay did not die of starvation, but of intestinal blockage. They died with full stomachs, their bellies distended and hard as stone. The physical effects of the famine were visible everywhere. The most common symptom was edema. Due to the lack of protein, fluid accumulated in the tissues, causing the body to swell. The victims' faces became round and puffy, and their limbs became heavy. A person suffering from severe edema could press a finger into their skin, and the indentation would remain for minutes. Others suffered from the opposite condition, wasting away until they were essentially skeletons covered in skin. The famine also ravaged the reproductive health of the nation. Women ceased to menstruate. The birth rate plummeted. In many provinces, the population growth turned negative for the first time in the history of the People's Republic. The physical weakness was so pervasive that labor ceased. The fields that should have been planted for the 1960 harvest were left fallow because the workforce was too weak to lift a hoe. The psychological toll was equally devastating. The traditional family structure, which had already been attacked by the commune system, crumbled under the pressure of survival. The bonds between parents and children were tested. There are numerous recorded accounts of families making the impossible choice of which child to feed and which to let die. The elderly, seen as a burden who could not contribute to the acquisition of food, were often the first to succumb to neglect. In the darkest corners of the famine, the taboo of cannibalism was broken. For decades, this subject was suppressed, but official party documents declassified in the 1980s and research by historians like Yang Jisheng have confirmed that it occurred on a significant scale. In villages where the granaries were empty and the roads were blocked, people driven by insanity and hunger consumed the flesh of the dead. The local authorities usually treated these acts as crimes, prosecuting the offenders, but the frequency of the reports indicates the depth of the desperation. Throughout 1960, the central leadership in Beijing remained partially insulated from the full scale of the horror. The flow of information was heavily filtered. The internal reference reports, which were meant to provide the leadership with unvarnished truth, were sanitized by officials terrified of being purged. However, the evidence was becoming impossible to hide. The Ministry of Commerce began to report that the state granaries were effectively empty. The export quotas could not be met. In the cities, the situation was better, but still dire. The urban population was protected by a rationing system. The state prioritized the survival of the industrial workforce and the party elite. However, rations were cut repeatedly. Meat and cooking oil disappeared from the urban diet. Scurvy and other deficiency diseases became common even in the capital, but the wall between the city and the countryside remained firm. The famine was fundamentally a rural catastrophe, borne by the peasants whose labor had built the state. The weather in 1960 was indeed poor. There were droughts in the north and floods in the south. The party leadership would later refer to this period as the 3 years of natural disasters, attributing the famine entirely to the weather and to the sudden withdrawal of Soviet technical advisors. While the weather was a contributing factor, meteorologists have since determined that the climatic events of 1959 to 1961 were not abnormal enough to cause a famine of this magnitude. The correlation between the regions with the most radical political leadership and the regions with the highest death rates confirms that the disaster was primarily man-made. By the end of 1960, the country was in a state of collapse. The economy had contracted, the agricultural sector was ruined, and the population was dying at a rate of thousands per day. The vision of overtaking Great Britain had dissolved into a struggle for basic biological survival. The leadership could no longer rely on the wind of exaggeration. They were forced to confront the silence of the countryside, a silence born of exhaustion and death. It was in this atmosphere of utter defeat that the political reckoning began, leading to the gradual and painful retreat from the policies of the Great Leap Forward. Part 6. The Retreat and the 7,000 Cadres Conference. By late 1960, the illusion of the Great Leap Forward had completely collapsed. The central government in Beijing, faced with a starving population and a disintegrating economy, began a quiet and painful retreat from the radical policies that had defined the previous 2 years. The turning point came in November 1960 with the issuance of an emergency directive known as the 12 Articles. This directive effectively dismantled the most destructive aspects of the commune system. The communal canteens were closed, and the peasants were allowed to return to their homes to cook their own meals. The frantic campaigns to produce steel were halted. Most importantly, the state restored a limited form of private property. Peasants were once again permitted to cultivate small private plots of land and to raise their own pigs and chickens. The rural markets, which had been banned as capitalist, were reopened to allow the trade of food. To understand the true extent of the damage, the senior leadership of the party undertook personal investigations. In early 1961, President Liu Shaoqi traveled to his home province of Hunan. He did not stick to the guided tours arranged by local officials. Instead, he visited the villages unannounced. He inspected the communal kitchens and saw the empty pots. He walked the fields and saw the lack of crops. In one telling incident, he inspected the dried human waste in the latrines and noted that it contained only fibrous plant matter, proof that the people were eating wild herbs and bark rather than grain. Liu Shaoqi returned to Beijing, shaken by what he had seen. He realized that the official explanation for the famine, that it was caused by bad weather, was a lie. He concluded that the disaster was primarily the result of human error and policy failure. This realization culminated in the 7,000 Cadres Conference, held in Beijing in January and February of 1962. It was the largest gathering of party officials in the history of the People's Republic. Over 7,000 officials, from the central leadership down to the county level, gathered in the Great Hall of the People to review the work of the past few years. The atmosphere at the conference was tense. The delegates were exhausted and demoralized. They were waiting for an explanation for the catastrophe that had befallen their country. Liu Shaoqi delivered the keynote report. In a departure from the prepared script, he spoke frankly about the causes of the famine. He referenced the peasants saying that the disaster was 3 parts natural and 7 parts man-made. This statement was a bombshell. It directly contradicted the official narrative that nature and the Soviet Union were to blame. By attributing 70% of the cause to human error, Liu Shaoqi was implicitly criticizing the architect of those policies, Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, sensing the shift in the room, offered a self-criticism. He admitted that he lacked expertise in economics and agriculture and accepted primary responsibility for the errors of the central leadership. However, observers noted that his apology was tactical. He absorbed the blame to prevent a total loss of authority, but he privately resented the humiliation. Following the conference, Mao retreated to what was called the second line of leadership. He withdrew from the daily management of the state, leaving the work of economic recovery to Liu Shaoqi and the General Secretary of the Secretariat, Deng Xiaoping. Under the stewardship of Liu and Deng, the Chinese government prioritized pragmatism over ideology. Deng Xiaoping famously summarized this approach with the maxim, "It does not matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it is a good cat." The priority was to feed the population, regardless of whether the methods were strictly socialist. The recovery was slow but steady. The agricultural sector began to rebound in 1962. The grain harvest improved and the immediate threat of mass starvation receded. By 1965, agricultural production had returned to the levels seen before the Great Leap Forward. The population began to grow again, and the social fabric of the villages, though scarred, began to mend. The Great Leap Forward officially ended in silence. There was no grand declaration of its conclusion, only the quiet abandonment of its slogans. The cost of this experiment was staggering. While the Chinese government did not release official death tolls for decades, modern demographic analysis provides a grim accounting. The most reliable estimates from historians and statisticians place the death toll between 30 million and 45 million people. To put this in perspective, this figure exceeds the total number of combat deaths in the First World War. The legacy of the Great Leap Forward extended far beyond the economic ruin. It sowed the seeds of the next great political tragedy in China. Mao Zedong viewed the pragmatic policies of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping with deep suspicion. He believed that by allowing private farming and markets, they were leading China back toward capitalism. He saw his own marginalization at the 7,000 Cadres conference as a betrayal. For the next 4 years, Mao would brood on this perceived treachery. He became convinced that the Communist Party itself had been infiltrated by revisionists who needed to be purged. The tensions that arose from the ashes of the famine would eventually ignite in 1966 with the launch of the Cultural Revolution. The Great Leap Forward demonstrated the destructive power of unchecked political ambition, and its shadow would hang over the nation for decades to come. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.